Hey everyone, this is Coach Jack of Longhorn Financial, and welcome to this episode of the Personal Finance Playbook. Today we're taking a little different direction on the show with my guest. We all have things that we treasure and items that we value, right? And they're probably hidden in a closet somewhere in your house or somewhere in the back or in the basement. But today's guest, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different and something even more valuable. Priceless, in fact. What, you ask? It's memories and family stories. So today I'd like to welcome my good friend Michelle Beckman, writer, founder of Sunday Dinner Stories, and a personal historian, and most importantly, a regret preventer. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Hi, Jack. Thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you so much for being here. Let's get right into it. So you're an expert in a service that maybe not a lot of people know about, right? You're the founder of Sunday Dinner Stories, and you're a personal historian. So tell us a little bit about what does that mean?
Well, first off, today, this month, May, is Personal History Month. So it's a great time to have this conversation. Hopefully everyone will start thinking about their personal history, and maybe they can even honor their mom on Mother's Day. Well, a personal historian is someone who partners with a family that wants their loved one to write or record their life story. So I usually help the parent or the grandparent write or record their beliefs, their values, their life lessons, their stories, and then they pass those down as books or playlists to the rest of their family. So it's all about knowing that you belong, have been heard, and will be remembered forever.
Okay, so that's very interesting because it's not something that people usually think of. And so on this show, we talk about personal finance. So I know I invited you on the show and I'm glad you're here, but tell us sort of in your experience, how does this relate to personal finance from the folks that you've dealt with?
Okay, well, we all know that we should have a financial legacy. We work with our estate planners, we have trusts, we have wills, we have healthcare proxies, things like that. But most people don't realize how important their family stories are to them. In fact, there's a company called Allianz Insurance. They ran a survey back in 2005 as well as in 2012. The survey was called the American Legacies Pulse Survey. And in that survey, they surveyed 2,600 baby boomers and seniors. And they found that baby boomers 10 times as more were interested in their family stories than they were in their parents' bank accounts. So by a factor of 10, they wanted the family stories, the traditions, the wishes from their parents more than they wanted their bank accounts. They also found that 86% of the baby boomers and 74% of the seniors felt that preserving their stories was the most important part of a legacy. So I kind of look at it as a legacy. It has two parts to it. We definitely have to do the financial legacy, which is what your show is normally about. We need to think about the money factors, the trusts, our investments,
Sure.
What we're doing with those. But we also need to think about the emotional legacy, the parts of the stories and the items that you have and why those things are important to you. And we need to pass those down to our families as well.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So when you think about passing down these kind of stories and these legacies, what are some of the key concepts or cornerstones of doing something like that?
So I actually created a program I call the Legacy of Love. I don't actually like the word legacy because I was in IT for a long time and it has a very bad connotation to it. So I call it the Legacy of Love, and it has 4 cornerstones. The first is beliefs, values, and life lessons. The second is treasured possessions. The third is facts and information. And the fourth is your wishes.
Okay, so let's talk about these a little bit. So let's start with the first ones, beliefs, values, and life lessons. And so share with us a little bit sort of what you mean by those words. And I see that you also have some props that you're going to introduce to our audience a little bit. So start with that first one and tell us, what does that mean?
Okay, so in the beliefs, values, and life lessons cornerstone, we're really trying to get a person to recognize their parent as someone other than as a person, not necessarily their parent, to get to know them more deeply. And the way that we do that is by like I said, writing or recording their stories. And usually we do that through books or playlists. I say playlists because CDs aren't as prominent anymore.
Right.
So here's one. This is called The Cute One, Memoirs of a Grateful Four-Eyed Nerd with Quacky Feet. And this is actually my uncle's book that we wrote together. In this book, he talks about his job as an engineer, his career as an engineer. He talks about his parents so that all of his children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews can learn more about them. And he tells lots of funny stories. He's an entertainer. And so it's very interesting, and it's a way for us to get to know who he really was, but it's also a way for us to get to know who our grandparents were because we never got to meet them.
Sure, okay.
Now here's another example. This is a little bit of a lighter example. This book is a children's book that we called The Alligator Door. My dad, when I recorded his stories, he told a story about how he caught a bank robber when he was in his 20s. So we recorded that story, and then I took it and made it into a poem, and then my children went through and drew the pictures for each stanza of the poem.
Wow, so your children drew those pictures?
Yes.
Wow, that's fantastic.
They drew them, one of them drew them and the other one colored them. And we gave this to him for Christmas. And after Christmas, we had him read the story as if he was reading it to his great-grandchildren that he'll probably never meet. We recorded that.
Wow.
And we have a CD in the back that has the story the way he originally told it and the story with like page turners so that the great-grandchildren would be able to learn about him and also have a story to read.
Wow,
So.
that's amazing. I mean, but that's really passing on the family story and the legacy, right? I mean, that makes it really come.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. So, so that's the first cornerstone. What about the treasured possessions, right? That's another cornerstone that you mentioned.
Well, as Americans, we all have a ton of stuff. Right? I actually belong to a Facebook group that is all about getting rid of your stuff. You have so much stuff in your house, and most of the time, the people who have the biggest issues are those who have received inheritances. They've had things passed down to them from their parents or grandparents. They have so much stuff that they have their memories are tied to, that they don't know how to get rid of it. They can't get rid of it. They won't let it go. So this portion is really to have you think about your treasured possessions from the perspective of a story. And after you start telling that story, you can let go of the possession. So here's an example of that. This is a teacup. My great aunt gave my sister and me her teacup collection. And so if we were doing this with her, we would go through with her and say, well, where did you get this teacup? Why is this important to you? You know, who did you used to have tea with? We actually started having tea parties with her in her 90s when she gave us these cups so that we could have that memory with her and our kids could have that memory with her. And the most important thing is, who do you want to be the custodian of this item when you can no longer take care of it? And what are they allowed to do with it? You need to give them the ability to get rid of that guilt. You know, are they allowed to sell it? Are they allowed to pass it on to someone? Or is it something that you really want kept in the family forever? It's just something that the people need to know what the guidelines are so they don't sit there after you've passed away and they worry about getting rid of it because they might hurt your feelings.
Right, you know, and that's a great point. You know, as I speak to folks about estate planning and things like that, oftentimes people will talk about what they want to leave to certain family members. But you're right, what doesn't often come up is what are they allowed to do with it? Are they allowed to sell it? Are they not allowed to sell it? A lot of times that's not clarified. So you end up with like fighting in the family when things like that happen.
Well, and they also don't ask if the person really wants it. And so people end up with things that they don't want and they don't have room for and they don't know what to do with it. Sometimes there's an item that could be that more than one child wants, but it's only one item. So this is another way to share that with them, to take a picture of it, tell the story, and then they can both have the story and the picture, even if they don't have the physical item. So this is all about looking at your physical estate and how you can pass that down to the family.
So the third one's facts and information cornerstone. So to me, that just sounds like the story. What do you mean by facts and information here?
So facts and information is about, it's about things like your family tree, your timeline, diaries, letters, things that you have in your family that are full of facts and information. So here's an example of a diary that my husband's grandfather kept when he was in World War II. So not only does this book have in it his thoughts and his feelings during the war and every day that he was in the war, but it also has facts about his time in the war. Where did he go? What did he do? What was his role? What was his rank in the military? So this is important too, because we need to keep that information. Here's another one. This is a book that is called The Amars of New York. This was actually written it was presented to the Huguenot Society in 1899. So this is one of my ancestors who wrote this book. And in it, he went and interviewed people from our family and friends to find out why our family left France in the late 1600s. In addition to that, he went through and found or completed the genealogy for our family for 5 years, our family tree all the way back to the 1600s. So this is like invaluable information. Genealogists would die for this kind of information. But in addition to that, he had the forethought to ask for the stories. And so we were able to understand what and why and how they left France.
Wow, okay. And what about the final category? I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me, but maybe not. As you're going through some of this, the final cornerstone of the program is simply your wishes.
Right.
Okay, so give us some detail around that.
Well, in the financial side, we capture things like your health care proxy and who your power of attorney should be. So who are those wishes? Who are the beneficiaries for your life insurance and things like that? Who do you wish to receive that kind of money? But in addition to that, on the emotional side, we have what are your wishes, say, in terms of your end-of-life care? What are your wishes in terms of, what do you want your funeral to be like? Do you want a celebration of life? Would you like a funeral? How would you like to be buried? Would you like to become a tree, which I thought was an interesting one? Or do you want a traditional burial? In addition to that, there are things like people sometimes want to have a say in what will be there in their obituary. Or as I worked with someone recently, he was very sick, was afraid that he might not make it through some treatment that he was going to have, and he wanted to talk to his children, but his children weren't ready to hear what he had to say. So he actually wrote his story, and then he also wrote a personal statement that would be read during his funeral by someone else.
Wow.
So it was a way for him to get his story to his family and his friends, and he ended up having a sense of peace after that, where he can now focus on the treatment and not on how to communicate with his family.
Sure.
Thankfully, he's in remission, so now he can share the story with them, and he can start the conversation. And the conversation is what is most important. Once they tell the story, you want to have the conversation with the family members.
Right. So, and thank you for sharing all this stuff. This is fantastic, and a lot of this is actually related to your own family. So, a question for you: when families end up reading their own story, right, of their grandparents and maybe who they never knew, or of other relatives, what's the impact that has of being able to read these stories on that family? I'm sure it's got to be pretty powerful.
It can have a huge impact. I'll give you my story because it's the one that I know the best. As I was growing up and I would learn about World War II in school, I would kind of slink down in my chair. I didn't want anyone to see me because I knew my family was German. My grandmother still spoke with a German accent. My grand aunt, my Aunt Lucy, had just come over. She came over in the 50s after the war, but she lived through World War II in Germany. And so I was very ashamed. I felt like I didn't want anybody to know that I was German. Now, that may just be the way that I interpreted it, but I was a little kid, and that's how I felt.
Sure.
Well, when I was in my 20s, early 20s, my Aunt Lucy, at the request of her children, I believe, she wrote her memoir, My Part of the War. And it's just a very simple book, and it's actually, this one is actually typed. It was typed on a regular typewriter. She wrote the story about how she got through World War II. And she talked a lot about her family as well as my side of the family. And I found out that my family wasn't evil. They tried to fight back against the Nazis as much as they could. And even my grandfather went over there, the grandfather that my uncle talked about in here, he went over for a vacation and he almost got thrown in jail because he had stood up to someone that he shouldn't have. So after I read that, the shame just kind of melted away, and I was able to kind of look at my family and what type of family I came from in a much, much different light. So I think that's kind of an extreme example, but everyone looks at the stories that you tell, whether you write them down or just tell them at the dinner table. Children and adults will take that, and it becomes part of their personal narrative.
Interesting. That's a great story. That's very interesting. I can, my family wasn't like that, but I can certainly empathize. I can understand. So one of the questions that I have about personal stories is, oftentimes we'll hear about celebrities or politicians or heads of state, having their biography written, right, and their life story, or famous individuals throughout history. But you do it for regular people. So why would someone would otherwise have just a ordinary life, right, a regular sort of day-to-day life, someone who lives in the area, why would they think about doing something like this?
Well, that's true. Well, most people think that doing this is only for the rich and famous, but like I said earlier, based on that survey, the baby boomers and their children really do want these stories. So there's a reason that they should continue. There's actually a study done by some Emory University professors. They called it Of Ketchup and Kin, and it talks about children who know their family history actually have a stronger sense of identity. They feel like they have more control over their lives. They have higher self-esteem, and they're more resilient than the kids that don't know their family history. So it is really important that even if you think that your life is ordinary, that you tell these stories, because like I said a minute ago, they will internalize and it will become part of their internal narrative about who they are. Just like when I talked about myself and the narrative I had, it was, I'm German, but I'm not evil. How can I reconcile that with what I'm being told? The stories that you tell will be able to help the children become, more resilient and self.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense. So now, because one of the things I think of sometimes would be is people would think that I'm not famous and I didn't do this. Why would someone read it? But let's suppose someone says, okay, I want to do this, but maybe I just want to take some baby steps, and maybe I'm going to try and write my own story myself, or maybe have a family member do it with me. What are some tips that you would share with folks who may want to do this themselves?
Okay, so when people ask me that, I usually have 5 tips to give them. The first tip is to know and speak to your audience. So here's a book from, it's called My Protocol, and this is written by Linda Spinelli. And she went through some cancer treatments. It's called My Protocol, How I Broke the Rules and Survived Cancer. Her audience was people who were going through cancer. So she would write to them differently than, say, what my dad might write in this children's book. When you think about your audience, you really want to be careful about the content. What age are you thinking about? When I did a recording for a hospice patient, she knew exactly what she wanted to say in her life story. The problem was that part of it was very traumatic and it was PG-13. So we need to separate out those stories so that the younger kids that would listen to majority of her story would not actually come across those PG-13 stories. So you want to be careful, you want to know who you're writing to or who you're recording for. Be careful of your language, make sure you know what, what rating that should be. And so knowing your audience helps with that. The second one is focus on 5-minute memoirs. So I coined that term. It's to focus on stories that can be told or read in 5 to 10 minutes. We live in a world of 140 characters right now. So I think that once we get their attention, we need to keep it until they can get through one bite-sized chunk of the story. So I tell them to focus on 5-minute memoirs, and that's something that's easy for people to write or read. It's usually 2 to 4 pages, handwritten, depending on what your handwriting is like. Okay. The third one is your story, your voice. So tell the story as if you were telling it at the dinner table or on the back porch sipping sweet tea. You know, you don't want to tell that story like you're in front of a lecture hall. You want it to sound like you. You should use the words that you normally use. You should not be using words that you look up in a thesaurus. You want to use the words that you would normally say. If you don't, your family is going to think that it's not authentic and it's not from you. Okay. The fourth one is to only focus on a handful of stories at a time. And I literally mean a handful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and your palm. So 5 or 6 stories. Yep. Otherwise, you get too overwhelmed. So take out a sheet of paper, write down the topics of 5 or 6 stories you think of. Start writing each of those as 5-minute memoirs. You will inevitably come up with other stories to tell. So take another piece of paper, write those 5 or 6 down. Leave those aside until you write the first 5 or 6. And then come back to them. And then the fifth tip I give is that you need to know that help is available. There are people who can help you write. There are people who can help you remember what memories you have. They can help you tell the stories differently. Regardless of whether you do it, whether you're doing writing or you're doing a recording, you will always need to do an edit. So make sure you hire an editor. Every writer hires an editor, and nobody's perfect, so you will need an editor no matter what. Mm-hmm. The other part of that tip is that there are 3 great organizations that have helped me along the way. One is the Association of Personal Historians. This group has people from every aspect of personal history, from interviewing all the way through book production or video production or something like that. The second is the Massachusetts Society of Genealogists. So there are lots of genealogy groups. If you're in Massachusetts, this is a great one. This group is so welcoming. They share so much information. Almost all of it is volunteer, and they can really help you make sense of your family tree and timelines, and even now they're getting all into the DNA and things like that. And the third one is the Beeren Institute that trains guided autobiographers. So these are instructors who can help you write your memoir on your own. So we do a guided program. So all 3 of those organizations really help people make progress on their memoirs or their autobiography or their life story.
But it can be done.
It can be done, and it is done all the time. In fact, I met a woman the other day in the shoe department who told me she's been working on her memoir for 10 years. And, you know, she may need a group that would help her continue and finish it and actually finish it.
Okay. Now, what are some of the challenges that people face, though, right? So let's take the flip side. Some of the challenges just a couple that if I were to write my own, right, and I want to do it myself, what are some of the things I might run into that I should watch out for?
So probably the most important challenge is at the very beginning. Most people are very humble, and if you ask them to write their story or record their story, they will think that they don't have a life that's worthy enough to actually record. So that's the first one, and we really, as adult children, we need to make it clear that this is why we want it. It's very important to us, and we'll give you whatever help is needed to actually complete the project. The second one is that many times people are afraid to tell the story. They think they don't sound exciting enough, or they think that their words don't sound good enough, and that's why they start to resort to like the thesaurus and all that kind of stuff, and then it doesn't sound like them, so it really isn't their story anymore. So it's important to just be yourself. The most important part of it is telling your story with yourself in it. Use your own emotions. If you're recording it, laugh. You know, some of the people that I record, it's so great to hear their laugh. And their family will get to hear that as well.
Okay, just be authentic, right? Be yourself, like you said. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're kind of running out of time here. So one last question. So let me ask you, what's something about people's personal history or writing people's personal history that individuals should know, but they commonly don't know?
So I would say that everyone has a story that is worth telling. So it kind of goes back to what I was just saying. There's a woman named Anna. Her nieces asked her to record her story. She was 94 years old, and she had a very simple life. Her husband passed away early. She never married again. She didn't have children. She worked in the same job for 30 years. She had a very simple life, and she could have thought that it wasn't worth sharing. But when she passed away, a year after we were finished, her family actually used parts of that in the funeral service. And they also talked about how generous she was, and how loving she was, and giving she was, and how important her life was. So her story became part of their internal narrative, and now they will be generous and giving and loving people as well. So it all goes back to what I said at the beginning. People need to know they belong, that they have been heard, and that they'll be remembered forever.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And so I'd like to thank all of you, the viewers, for joining us today for this episode of the Personal Finance Playbook. Thanks, many, many thanks to my special guest, Michelle Beckman of Sunday Dinner Stories. I got to tell you, as she was speaking, I was off camera, but I was thinking a lot about my own family and my own personal stories. So it really gave me quite a bit of food for thought, as I hope it did for you. Join us again next time on the Personal Finance Playbook when we tackle another topic. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.